Now we're looking at part 8 of the review, number 8A, B, and C, which again is finding the inverse, just like we did on the first part, or earlier in the review, but now we're dealing with radical functions instead of just linear functions. We're dealing with functions that have cube roots. So what we're going to do is the same thing. F of x is the same as y, so I'm going to write that as y equals 2 times the cube root of x. All I've done is substitute the y in for f of x because they're the same thing. Now to find the inverse, you switch the domain and range, so I'm going to flip-flop the x and y. So I'm going to write this as x equals 2 times the cube root of y. Now when we have this, remember, just like we did on the previous, I want to isolate my radical. So is there anything I can do to isolate it? Well, then I have a 2 in the front, so I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And that gives me x over 2, x over 2 equals the cube root of y. And if you remember, to get rid of a cube root, we actually cube it. We do the inverse operation. So I'm going to cube both sides. Cube of a cube root, that's just going to leave me with y. And then this is going to leave me with x cubed on top and 2 cubed on the bottom. And that means x cubed over 8 equals y. The other way you can write this is 1/8 x cubed equals y. Both of these are correct. There's 2 different ways to write it. So let's go ahead and let's look at 8b. And I'll go ahead and start it here. In 8b, f of x equals the cube root of x minus 3 equals 1. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually find the inverse of this particular function. Now, it says equals 1 on your paper. I'm not sure if that is a misprint. I'm just going to find the inverse of this. So let's go ahead and find the inverse. So I'm going to, number 1, rewrite this. And that's going to be y equals cube root of x minus 3. So now I want to find the inverse function. So I switch the domain and range, the x and y. Move this up a little bit. Switch the x and y. And so this becomes x equals the cube root of y minus 3. So after we do this, I need to see if there's anything I can do to isolate the radical. Well, I can't. The radical is already as isolated as it's going to be. So what we're going to do is we're going to cube both sides because we want to get rid of that cube root. The way to get rid of the cube root is to cube. So x cubed on this side and y minus 3 on this side. So my last step is to get the y by itself. I'm going to add the 3 to both sides. And so my inverse function is x cubed plus 3 equals y. And that is my inverse function. Notice that the inverse of a cube root is a cubic. The inverse of a cube root is a cubic. And it's going to work that way all the time. So let's look at the final one. Let's look at C. And we'll do C here. C f of x equals 3/4 cube root of x plus 5. So what I'm going to do with this one is the same thing. I'm going to replace the f of x. I'm going to make it a y. Again, just terminology. And then now that I have my function written out here, if I want to find the inverse, I'm going to have to flip-flop the domain and range, which is the x and y. So this becomes x, and this becomes y. So I'm going to move on, and keeping in form with everything else, I want to isolate the radical. I always circle the term I want to isolate. That helps me out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract this 5. Apologize for the marker. So x minus 5 equals 3/4 cube root of y. So my next question is going to be, how do I get rid of that 3/4? Well, if you remember algebraic rules, if I want to get rid of the 3/4, I multiply both sides of the equation by 3/4. And I'm going to put parentheses around each side so you know that each side is multiplied by 3/4. What this is going to do on this side is that 4/3. That's what happens when you film these things at midnight. So that's 4/3. You multiply by the reciprocal of what you're trying to eliminate. Now, if this were just 1/4, then we could just multiply both sides by 4, because you wouldn't have to write out 4/1. But what this creates now is the 4 and the 4 reduce, and the 3 and the 3 reduce. So I'm just left with cube root of y on this side. And on this side, I'm going to distribute 4/3 times x is 4/3 x. And 4/3 times -5 is -20/3. So now my last step is I want to get rid of this cube root. So I'm going to cube both sides. And when I do that, I end up with y on this side and 4/3 x minus 20/3 cubed on this side. I am not going to take the time to expand that all the way out because it would be kind of a pain, but that's how you do it. And again, we wrote this as y, switched the x and y, moved the 5, got rid of the 3/4 by multiplying by its reciprocal. So we got 4x/3, and then we've got -20/3. And then to get rid of the cube root, we cube both sides. And that is number 8, finding the inverse.